So thanks. I am new to many of you. I think I've made it to one or two of these talks, but it's really a pleasure to be here with you. So the first thing I'm going to do is apologize for having an acronym in my title that I haven't spelled out, but FSRC is the Food Systems Research Center. It's been in existence for about 2.5 years now. And many of you probably have run across Meredith Niles, who was the acting director of the gun. While Taylor was on leave, and she has been the associate director of the FSRC since its existence. But I'm the first inaugural director. I came in December, and I've been learning a lot about UVM and about food systems and environmental research here. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about why it's really interesting to look at food systems, how that concept evolved, and talk a bit about the kind of research that we're trying to motivate at the FSRC. But before I start, let me go to the next page, just to give you a hint. Okay, can you just close your eyes for me and think about what you ate last night? Yeah? Think about why you ate what you ate last night. I'm not judging you. I just want you to be like, why did I eat that? Maybe it's because your mom made it for you. Maybe it's because your roommate left it in the fridge and it looked really good. Maybe it's because like you plan your menus really thoughtfully, or maybe it's because it was free food at a seminar or a party. Okay? But now think about, how did you feel after you ate that? Were you satisfied? Were you happy? Did you feel healthy? Did you feel gross because like it was a hamburger or it was barbecued beef? And then think about any decisions that you made after that meal about what you're going to eat the next time, like this morning, or for lunch, or for dinner. Okay. And then my last request is reflect on how often you do that. How often, when you think about what you're going to eat or what you have eaten, do you go through like an almost automatic process of reflecting on, was that the right thing to eat? Was that a good decision? Why did I do that? And so my point about that is food is inherently personal to all of us. Yeah, we do it, we eat it every day. Many of us in this room have more than enough to eat. But as you'll know, many other people don't. They like their daily existence is a constant struggle to find enough food. Many of us have the luxury of deciding, am I going to eat meat today or am I not going to eat meat today? Do I have enough milk or do I not have enough milk? But again, that's not the case for many other people within Vermont as well as across the globe. And then lastly, we make choices about what we want food to do for our bodies, what we want it to do for the environment, what we want it to do for social equity, what we want it to do for rural livelihoods, and how we want it to affect our landscapes. That's a lot of pressure on, a box of tofu or a can of ravioli. But it's what makes food so interesting to study, because all of us have, at a minimum, an intense personal connection to food. And so it's why I get so excited and so passionate about it. Am I stepping on something and making the screen go weird at all? Oh, okay. I got it. All right, because yeah. Okay. Sorry about that. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about food systems concepts. I have had the privilege of being sort of an early food systems researcher in the late 2000s. And I watched sort of resistance to that concept. And then all of a sudden, 5 years ago, whoa, food system, yeah, man, we do food systems research, it's so cool. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. I'm going to try to give you some examples of how I think using a food systems approach particularly changes our understanding of what solutions might look like. And then I'm just going to talk a little bit about the FSRC, what we're trying to do on campus, what we have done, and what we want to become. Okay. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how I worked with the food systems concept and what this particular project that I worked on was trying to do. So it was a project called Global Environmental Change and Food Systems, and it was trying to link together, I'm going to say 3 to 4 predominant schools of thought, but it was coming first from this tradition of agricultural systems. Okay, so what you'll see here is somebody's idea of how to model what's going on in a livestock and mixed crop system. And there's lots of arrows going between things. And this is because what ag systems thinking did for traditional plot-based agriculturalists was to help them understand that even though they were trying to control everything on their little plot, like how much manure, how much fertilizer, exactly how many rows of corn, how often were the livestock going to come in and out, On an actual real farm, things are very complicated. The drivers of what might be your economic output or your crop yields are many, and they're complicated, and they're all linked together. And so this was sort of like the beginning of this kind of, well, everything is part of a system. There are flows between these systems. Some things stay on the farm, some things stay on the farm or absorbed by the farm, like nutrients, but some things go off the farm, like other nutrients that you didn't intend to go off the farm. A lot of the labor goes into the farm, but then comes off the farm as well. So that was kind of like, oh wow, there's a lot more going on in these fields than we thought, and there are a lot of links between components that we didn't know about. So this is sort of like, okay, we're going to do this is kind of like systems thinking comes to basic agriculture. Tradition is quite a different one, and this was, we really wanted to understand food security. So I've not written it on here because it's a lot of words, but the basic definition of food security is that food security exists when all people at all times have physical and economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food that meets their dietary needs and food preferences for an active and healthy life. Now that's a definition that's been around since 1996, the World Food Summit. I'm gonna read it again. Food security exists when all people at all times have physical and economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food that meets their dietary needs and food preferences for an active and healthy life. So there's a lot embedded in that one sentence, and this has spawned reams and reams of literature. It is the definition that most of the aid agencies, UN agencies, the World Bank, where I used to work, the Consultative Group on International Agricultural Research, that's the definition of food security. It's been tinkered with and modified, but the important thing for this framework that I'm going to go through is if people who study food security will often break it down into these 4 dimensions, okay? So first of all, and this is the one that agriculturalists tend to focus on the most, is making food available, okay? And that's not just about enough food, it's that it's quality food, right? So it's nutritious food. The second thing to come in was the idea that people had to have access. And that's not just about, is there a store? It's about, do I have money? Yeah? Do I have the knowledge? Is the food distributed in a way so that like I can get access to it? And if you think about our understanding, for example, a phenomenon like food deserts, like that there just aren't grocery stores in certain kinds of neighborhoods, then you'll start to understand how this issue of access kind of really blew open people's naive understanding initially that availability was enough. As long as there was food, people would be fine. So then we brought in this notion of access. Then things got even more complicated, and we came up with this notion of utilization. And that really has to do with, is my body healthy enough that when I eat this food, it's giving me the nutritional value? So disease and health status are big drivers of utilization, but so are things like, do I have clean water? Do I have good sanitation? And this gets a little bit, well, this is where, if my dietitian colleagues were here, there's a lot in here as well about, do I have the knowledge, am I in a food environment that allows me to make healthy choices and to know how to properly cook the food and give it to my family. And then lastly, this is kind of the newest concept. I mean, and though I'm sure this definition gets played with and tinkered with all of the time, but I still think these are kind of the 4. But this notion of stability, and this really comes from a lot of research on famines, what food shocks will do to people, price shocks, as well as climate shocks. So it's this idea that people need to have food access and availability all throughout the year. Yeah. So again, a lot of this literature is very influenced by like what happens to people during droughts or during floods, where the food production goes down to almost nothing. And so then you start to look at things like, well, we need to bring in other kinds of food, we import it from elsewhere, or come up with food aid programs. Okay, so this was sort of the outcomes, if you will, that we wanted to understand food systems as being partially responsible for. But then there was one more body of thought, which was this idea that many ag economists are very familiar with, which is that this is a food system. But I call this a food supply chain. It's very linear, but this is, again, this is from the US Department of Agriculture. This is how a lot of economists that we were working with thought of it. It's okay, food is produced, then it gets processed, then it's aggregated and distributed, and then it goes to consumers. And then we're done, right? That's the food supply chain, we're done. Nobody really pays attention to what goes on in the consumption side, how consumers engage with their food. And then what's starting to happen now with environmental issues is, what about after it leaves the consumer, we eat it or we don't eat it, but there's this whole pile of waste to take account of. So we, who are influenced by ecological systems thinking, actually, this, for those of you, I mean, I know Taylor's somewhere online, but so some of you may have heard of something called the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, which is sort of this big effort to look at ecosystem drivers and the notion that we get services from ecosystems. And so this framework is kind of derived from that sort of thinking. So the first thing we did was we said, okay, this is our understanding of food system outcomes. So you'll see the definition of food security embedded in here. But because we were thinking about environmental outcomes and other kinds of social welfare outcomes that aren't directly related to food security, we put them in as boxes as well. So we, at this time, talked about environmental capital. We could have said ecosystem services, but it's basically sort of the trying to capture the impact on environmental quality that food systems have. And then the other one was social welfare. So really trying to look at people who work in food systems, all the way through from production to processing. And so then you said, okay, we understand that there's, a group of economists who think of sort of food system activities as these: producing food, processing it, distributing and retailing it, and consuming it. But this is 2008, so there's a lot of stuff missing from here that I'll get to, but this was sort of what we came to. And then we were thinking about, okay, what are drivers of food system activities? And there are some natural drivers like volcanoes and solar cycles. I think I have the information on this wrong. Here we go. This is what I wanted to come to. But there are a lot of social economic drivers and global environmental change drivers that are interacting and both directly and indirectly influencing how food is produced, having influences on people's food security status that is not directly influenced by the food system activities. But then, and this was really important, at this time, people were becoming very interested in the environmental feedbacks from food system activities and some of the socioeconomic feedbacks. So this was our attempt from the Global Environmental Change and Food Systems Project. It really was one of the first times that a group tried to bring together this kind of ag systems thinking, this global environmental change thinking, with such an explicit focus on food security outcomes. And so for a number of years, we this kind of lived out there. I left this program about in 2010, and I went to work for Livestock Research Institute. But this kind of hung there, and I worked with a lot of colleagues in back in the ag development community, trying to say, if we really want to talk about food security and environmental change, we need a food systems angle. We're like, no, that's so complicated. No, we're going to do agriculture. Maybe we'll look at the impact of climate change on agriculture. Maybe we'll look at some of the environmental outcomes from agriculture, particularly livestock scientists wanted to do this. But all of this, it's just complicated. And so I just want to say that is the challenge of this kind of all-embracing complex systems thinking, is that people can their eyes can start to glaze over. It's so complicated, I can't find a solution. The one thing this did do with some colleagues was allow them to see themselves, okay? So let's say you're somebody you're like a land cover and soils researcher, right? But you want to understand how your piece of research feeds into these more complicated food system and environmental outcomes. There you are, that's your entry point, right? So that is another sort of useful thing that these kinds of conceptual frameworks can do. Even though I know the qualitative social scientists and people who don't think in diagrams, which actually I don't, will say, well, this is kind of very reductionist and it's putting lines and arrows with things, but it's just a conceptual framework to kind of unpack some of this complexity. Okay, so then now we're here in 2023, and as I said, every agency you can think of is talking about food systems. So this is the World Bank. They have a Food Systems 2030. This is now the FAO and other parts of the UN. This is about the 10th food system publication that they have on there. And look how far they're thinking about it. They're talking about food systems thinking as a guide for multi-stakeholder collaboration. Wow, that's so cool. This is a diagram from USAID's Resilient Food Systems conceptual framework. It's the same idea, right? They're thinking about the outcomes of interest that we're really interested in. We're looking at understanding all of these different drivers. Again, can we make an intervention that would change how one of these drivers is influencing these outcomes? The like conceptualization of what's important in a food system has evolved. So now we look at food supply. We talk about the food environment rather than determinants of food security. So different people can unpack it. What's also happened now is a lot more people are explicitly recognizing the role of the private sector and the need for investment to kind of influence food system outcomes. So I would say the big things that have happened in the last 15 years is a lot of lessons about health and nutrition and how we understand those outcomes. A lot of attention to governance, and I'll come to an example in a minute. And then this realization that that food systems encompass much more than agriculture. So we understand that, but as I would sort of ultimately like to argue, we're still not doing enough research that embraces this whole food systems concept. Right. So this is an example of how some of the thinking around nutritional outcomes, I know Chris is not, he's going to criticize this because he's a diet person, but so this is one of the areas I think people who understand how, so there was a whole school of thought that thought if we just get people to grow more food, they'll automatically be more food secure. And they did an evaluation of themselves after about like 15 years of this research, and they found out, wow, that didn't work. Why not? Okay, and then they went back and they said, because we didn't have a conceptual framework, we didn't understand the causal mechanisms. No one realized that women are the people in households who prepare most of the food and look after their husbands, their partners, their children's, their mothers. They are the people who take care of most of the food security outcomes. So then what you'll see here is now they understand that there are individual factors that influence your health status. There are what we call the food environment settings, like where do you go to school? How much do you work? What kinds of food service and retail establishments are there? There's all of these cultural and social issues that are influencing what you might eat. Everything from your lifestyle to your body image to what you believe is good food. And then there's all what they're calling here sectors of influence, right? There's the whole policy and government sphere that could influence. And so this led to some really interesting work on individual choices about diet, but also how it might be possible for policy to try to encourage improved nutritional outcomes. So I think this is some of the sort of best work that we've seen in the last decade that's really tried to look at the empirical basis for how we understand nutritional outcomes. A second kind of thinking that this sort of interest in systems and connections between things. And so again, some of the ecologists in the room will understand this idea about teleconnections and how links between disparate systems, disparate scales, and disparate geographies have increased with globalization, right? So we now, for an example, would be that probably the food on your table in a given week doesn't just come from Vermont, right? It doesn't even just come from the United States, okay? The price shock of 2008, which was a big wake-up call for me at that time, was like, wow, if biofuel prices really increase in the United States, there's going to be rice crops fail in India and Thailand. We're going to see price shocks reverberating throughout the global system and food insecurity in places that we didn't think about it. So a sexy way that people like to talk about it is to think of agri-food systems as teleconnected. And so there's a woman named Hallie Eakin who did a lot of very interesting work on this early on. She was one of the first people to really look at these teleconnections in the context of food, and it's because she's an expert in Mexican maize systems. And so I'm not going to walk through this entire diagram, but she was basically arguing that there are connections between the U.S. maize system and the U.S. biofuel system that are linked to energy and agriculture, right? This was at a time when there was a lot of investment in U.S. biofuels, and it was affecting the availability of maize for human consumption. But what nobody was really paying attention to is how this was playing out in our neighbor right to the south, which is Mexico, where maize is really important for human and livestock consumption, but there are these very tight links to policy decisions that are made in the US. I mean, there are a lot of other examples now. There are people have done studies on the influence between soy production in Brazil and demand for meat in China, et cetera. But so this starts to bring up questions about, again, like how can international trade play into governing food systems? But it also brings us back to individual decisions. Like, yeah, am I going to eat beef that's only fed on corn? How much can I, as one consumer, do to influence some of these big outcomes? And then the last point that I want to make, that some of this thinking has led to, is this idea that trade-offs are inevitable. Okay, and what I mean by that, so let's think of a really simple example. So what I find in this research is everybody wants to fix food systems, right? I'm going to be a vegetarian. I was a vegetarian when I was 22 because I was like, yeah, meat's bad. It's really damaging for the environment. I'm going to be a vegetarian. And then I was living in Wisconsin and I was staying in the middle of the co-op and I was going to buy broccoli from Guatemala. But then there was like, you know, frozen meat right from Wisconsin and yogurt from Wisconsin. And I started having like this little identity crisis, like, which one should I eat? Which one's better? Not for me, but like for the planet and for people's livelihoods. And I didn't know the answer. And so even now I'm working with all of these food systems research here at UVM and they're like, which one is better? Which food system is better for Vermont? And I'm like, actually, none of them is better in all the dimensions. So people used to map trade-offs in terms of like these spider diagrams, like, right, you know, you have like, you know, healthy environment, nutrition for people, cheap food, you'd have it like in these stars, and then it sort of map, well, like this food system is going to give people really cheap food, but it's terrible for the environment, or your greenhouse gas emissions are going to go down, but the food's going to be really expensive. I came across this as kind of a more interesting way to look at not just the trade-offs, but the synergies. This is a case study that these researchers did, looking at different food system pathways in Nakuru, Kenya. And so they just have like some outcomes of interest for this particular group of stakeholders, which are like, you know, GDP from agriculture, poverty, undernourishment, undernutrition, social equity, adaptation, and soil quality. And then so anything in the positive is a synergy, right? So this pathway will mean that we can achieve a reduction in poverty and an improvement in agricultural GDP. But if there's a negative one, you'll see that, well, we might improve agricultural GDP, but it's going to be at the expense of how able we are to adapt to climate change. So they have the numbers here on the bottom, and then you can see the darker the red, the stronger the negative trade-off is, and the brighter the green, the more likely the synergy is. So what I would argue is just about any food system pathway that we want to think about in pretty much any context is going to involve these trade-offs. So when I used to work at a livestock research institute, we got a lot of flack from northern donors who were like, but livestock produce greenhouse gas emissions, overconsumption of meat is bad for people's health. We're like, yeah, but we do most of our research in sub-Saharan Africa, where people eat meat, if they're lucky, once a month or once every 2 months. Milk is like the most nutrient-dense and protein-rich source of food for children under 1,000 days and pregnant women and other vulnerable groups. Not only that, but livestock are an asset, they're a savings, they're really important to integrating waste management. They eat biomass that people don't want to eat. You can't just knock livestock because they have all of these other really important values. Okay, so why do we have a food systems research center at UVM? Why do we, first of all, food, I hope I've convinced you now, is way more complicated and interesting than just agricultural commodities. And there are no silver bullets. So we need to do research. We need to do really good research that generates evidence and helps people from us through to policymakers think about how to make complicated decisions. But it needs to be a certain kind of research. It needs to be multidisciplinary, it needs to be user-driven, and it needs to be applied and problem-oriented. And we need a center, because this kind of research, and this is what I've done my entire career, it needs good facilitation. So it needs financial resources, which we are lucky to have, but it needs someone like me who's just going to go around and talk to people and get their good ideas and say, oh, this sounds like a nice research call, or oh, let's do an experiment, or oh, Victoria knows she's on one of the competitive grants that we recently put out. But just this last point is really important, and I know Gunn tries to do the same thing. We need safe spaces for these complicated discussions that we all feel quite passionate about. So it's unique. It's a long-term commitment from the USDA to the University of Vermont, recognizing the long tradition of food systems research that UVM has had. Many of you will have seen the New Hills building. That's us. We're up on the top corner. There's going to be about 25 USDA Ag Research Service staff at a minimum in that building as well. Then on the downstairs, there's going to be Senator Leahy, who is the wonderful benefactor of this center. Really important. It's the first time in 25 years that they've established a research center, and they've never had one that looked at food systems. ARS is really known for like, oh, this was the cover crops one. This is the maize one. So it's really cool that they've taken this leap of faith. But it means that we have a lot of capacity building and development and stakeholder engagement to do. So what have we done so far? In the first 2.5 years, we funded some postdocs in sustainable dairy. We gave people like Heather and Joshua some fun equipment to play with. We funded graduate students. We've also funded undergraduate fellows, and I don't know if any of you are on the UVM news list, but Colleen, who's in the back there, made some really nice videos about the undergraduate fellows. Undergraduates, please. Those summer experiences unsubscribed, and they were really fun and really cool. I mean, people are in like top UVM scientist labs doing research. We are just starting, and I'm going to look at Chris again, this new experiment in providing some startup costs for tenure track faculty who are going to become like FSRC fellows in the same way that you all have fellows. We've actually funded over 100 people, and we've spent more than $3 million so far in research. So what are a couple of big initiatives that we have going on? So the first one are grants in measuring food system sustainability. It may seem less than obvious, but many policymakers in the world still rely on data, data to make their decisions. And they want to know, how do we make food systems more sustainable? And we don't actually have the data for the Northeast region, for many regions actually. We're particularly right now focusing on the Northeastern US. And we're looking at all of these dimensions, okay? And we're insisting that the UVM researchers do it in partnership with communities, with community users. So people like NOFA or the Vermont Food Bank, Vermont Farm to Plate, etc. These initial grants are for 3 years, but this is an investment that we are making probably 10 to 20 years out from now. And it's really exciting. It's never been done. Come back to us in a couple of years and we'll be able to talk about which methods work, what are the trade-offs. At the moment, we're looking at plant-based proteins, maple syrup. Victoria is involved in a project looking at the social dimensions of sustainability, and that one is like very methodological. We really don't know what some of these issues are and how to ask people about them in a meaningful way. And then there's another one on consumer-facing agriculture, so all the agritourism that we see in and around Vermont. Second big project that we're working on right now is called ASPIRES. It's got this lovely acronym: Alternative System Pathways for Interconnected Resilience, Equity, and Sustainability. But basically, it's this idea that we want to be user engaged and user driven, but we don't want the users to tell us what their problems are. We're really focused on like, what is the solution that you're really invested in? For example, this policy that's being proposed, this vision for New England feeding New England. The idea that by 2060, 50% of the food that New England consumes could come from New England. It's a measure that a number of groups in and around New England, particularly here in Vermont, are quite invested in, but they know that they need to do research to find out exactly how it might be feasible, who would be able to afford that food, what kind of food would it be, and what happens when we had a crappy summer like we just did, and you can't even buy a pumpkin, let alone apples. This is an exploration in not just in what do we think people think are solutions, but how do we actually get those food system stakeholders to want to engage with the research endeavor? Because a lot of them are very action oriented and they're like, yeah, how can research really help us? So that's another sort of content as well as methodological innovation. And then now I'm coming up to my last slide. Because I'm the inaugural director, there's an expectation that I will develop a vision for this semester. I'm coming and getting around to it. But I think for me, what is going to make us unique is this idea that we're going to do engaged research, okay? So we're going to be looking at issues that real people think are important. But we've got to do empirical research. Yeah, a lot of, because we all care so deeply about food. There's a lot of stories, right? Well, a vegan diet is really good, blah, blah, blah. No, we still need to have livestock. How much livestock? Da, 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 da. Oh, the problem is people don't have enough access to fruits and vegetables. So that should be the focus. And again, people like the Vermont Ag Agency, they've been under-resourced for such a long time that they're not actually sure. Like they asked us to help them redo their entire trends in dairy for New England report, because the data is over a decade old and the dairy sector has changed so much in the last 10 years. So I think that's kind of like going to be this is going to be our vision statement. And it's much more challenging than you think to insist that we're going to do empirical research when people have such highly normative notions about what food should do and be. We want to work on improving our community outreach and engagement. And then we're thinking about developing some research opportunities. Nutrition is an area, and so think back to what I said. This kind of food systems thinking has its origins in ag systems thinking. We're really disappointed that until now, with all of our funding and our work, we've not sort of cracked into the nutrition and food security community. So that's a nut we have to crack. We have to talk with them about, like, what kind of research do you think would be interesting? How could we partner with you? Okay, climate resilience, this is my whole career, and the summer that we just had has meant that lots and lots of people want to focus on this, but we really have very poor understandings of how to measure climate resilience, how to think about it over time. And then again, this emphasis on long-term empirical data collection, and how can we kind of invest in the New England landscape to set this up in a robust way, so that in 15 years we're like, wow, look at that, look what we've learned about the Northeast. So that's it, that's me, I'm done. It was really fun to talk with you guys, and now I think we have some time for Q&A.